welcome everybody who has joined us thus far. I'm going to leave this poll up for another second, but my name is Greg Manny, and I'm an Associate Director of Admission and the Coordinator of Global Outreach for Dartmouth College. And with me today is Professor Lisa Baldes, who is an absolute rock star, and we're really excited to have her here. And she is going to be presenting about kind of gender in the legislatures of the world. And so she's the expert, so I'm gonna pass it off to her. And for those of you who haven't yet, please make sure you fill out that poll as you come in. So Professor Baldes, take it away.
Hi, well, thanks so much. Welcome, Prospies. We're really excited to have you here tonight. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight. Tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about an area of research that I've been working in for some time. I am a professor of government and Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies. Government is the name we call political science here at Dartmouth, and Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean studies is, we know it as LALAX on campus. And LALAX focuses on the study of that region of the world, plus Latinos in the US from all different perspectives: politics, economics, culture, film, art, literature, history, all kinds of things in that geographic area. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit, and it's a very interactive lecture. As you can already tell, I've already given you a poll. The percentage of men and women who hold seats in parliaments around the world has become a really standard indicator of both gender equality, but also an indicator of democratic representation. And this is something that countries typically report. And for political scientists, one question that has become the subject of a lot of really interesting research is what makes the ratio of men to women in legislative office higher in some countries than others, or what explains the variation, the cross-national variation, in terms of the percentage of men and women who serve, who are elected generally to legislative office. So tonight, I've asked you a poll. And in that poll, what I'm doing is eliciting your hypotheses about answers to these questions. And we'll unpack what that means. We'll review the results of the poll in a minute. We're going to be explicit and generate the hypotheses about how we might explain that variation. And then we'll compare the intuitions that you guys come up with research that's being done in political science. So I think I've given everybody enough time. Greg, can you share the results of that poll? Oh, great. How isn't that great? Okay, so the first question: men make up what percentage of the world's legislators? Now, typically I see this question asked as what percentage of the world's legislators are women, but I flipped it a little bit just to kind of get you to think a little bit. So 24% of you, nearly a quarter of you, said 95%, 41% said 90%, and 34% of you said 75%. Nobody said 55%, which is really interesting. So I'd say that's kind of split 1/3 for more or less for each of those categories. Second question: what place does the United States hold in the global ranking of women in legislative office out of 188 countries for which we have data? Number one, nobody picked the United States as holding the first position. 14% of you said the United States is number 6 in the global ranking. 69% of you said the United States is in 57th position, and 17% of you said we're in the 82nd place. And then the third question: which of these countries has the highest percentage of women in legislative office? Palau, a small country in the Pacific Islands. Nobody's put Palau at the top of the list. Ethiopia, 3%. United Arab Emirates, 10%. Sweden, 72%. So that's quite a significant majority. That's over a 2/3 majority of you put Sweden in the top ranked place. And then 14 of you said Mexico. So let's put those aside for a second and let's look at the data. So I'm going to share my screen. And you guys know that there's always a little funny pause in screen sharing because you've been doing Zoom a lot. And I'm going to assume that everybody can see what I'm looking at here. And if you can't see something that says global and regional averages of women in national parliaments, I hope you will let me know. So here's the answer. Let's see the answer to the first question. So this tells us what is the global average of women in national parliaments. This is data from the International Parliamentary Union, which collects data on national parliaments of all different kinds of data. It's a really interesting source. And you can see that this is the averages for March 2021. So it's very, very fresh data. It's been updated very recently as of March 2021. So let's see here. So the answer is across all chambers of legislative office in the world, 25.4% are women. And so that is the third option there. 75 means about 75% are men. And there's something else interesting here that I want to point out in this data. Every time I look at this chart or this website, I see something new, not only because there's something I haven't noticed before, but because there are significant changes. And over the course of the years that I've been looking at it, that number, that 25%, has kind of gradually increased. I think it was like 17% maybe 10 years ago. So it's that's quite a significant jump. The other thing that's really interesting here is that so the total number of members of parliament in the world is 38,757. And we know the gender breakdown for almost all of them, all right? We know, and there may be, actually, when I looked at this yesterday, it was 100%. We knew 100%, so something has changed. But the point is, there's actually data collected on gender breakdown for legislators around the world. That did not used to be the case. So this gives you a sense of countries are now seeing this as an important indicator, and they are measuring and tracking for themselves what's the gender breakdown in legislative office. Okay, so the second question is, what ranking does the United States hold in the world ranking? So here we have monthly ranking of women in national parliaments, and I'm just going to scroll down here until you tell me where you see the United States, and you'll also see the answer to the second question. So the country in first place is Rwanda, followed by Cuba, Bolivia, third, United Arab Emirates, fifth, Mexico, Sweden is number 7, and we'll see where Palau is, and we'll see where the United States is. So I'm just going to keep scrolling. Andorra, and if we were not doing a webinar here, I'd get you to point out when I need to stop. We might pause at a country or two, but I'm just going to keep scrolling down here until we find the United States. So we're well past number 55. There we are. The United States is in 82nd place in the world rankings, ranked alongside Armenia and just above Israel in terms of the percentage of women in elective office. And you can see we're kind of clustered here in terms of the percentage, with about 23% of the legislators being women. So you can also see here, interestingly enough, that the prediction of Sweden is actually the third of those countries in terms of the percentage of women in elective office. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and let's talk about these findings for a second. So what explains the results that we see? There are hypotheses behind your answers, and I want to unpack those a little bit. Thank you. So 2 questions really come to mind here. One is, why so few women relative to men? A common way that people think about this is that women make up half the population of the world. So we would expect that in terms of legislative representation, women would make up half of the legislators who hold office, who are elected to office. And as I've told you, it's 25%, and there's variation across countries, but nowhere, well, actually, I'm not sure that's true. That's nowhere they're the majority. I think they actually are the majority in some countries now. But one question to ask is, why so few women? And the question we're going to focus on tonight is, how do we account for this cross-national variation? So your kind of intuitive answer to that question of how you explain cross-national variation is actually implicit in the answers that you gave in this poll. So something led you to place the United States at a certain position, and something led you to rank Sweden or the United Arab Emirates or Mexico as higher rank than those other countries. And I wonder if you could just write down for me just a few words, just on your own. I'm not going to see this. What do you think explains why some countries are higher and some countries are lower in terms of the percentage of women in office? So just go ahead and write it down, just a few words. I'll give you a minute. And then I'm going to go over what some of the research says in terms of how what we've learned about the answer to that question from research that political scientists around the country and around the world are doing, including here at Dartmouth. So I'll just give you a minute. Okay, and since I can't really get any visual feedback in terms of what your answers are or what you're thinking, let me kind of dive into this. So one of the answers that a lot of people give in terms of what explains this variation is the expectation that countries that are more developed in terms socioeconomically more developed are likely to have higher percentages of women in office. So I think there's a sense there of why Sweden would be ranked so highly. Sweden is seen as a kind of social democratic liberal country. There's a strong association with the Nordic countries and a strong status of women's rights. So there's an expectation there that these higher levels of development and a strong commitment to liberal democracy are what explain the percentage of women in office. And while that is a powerful and intuitive hypothesis, there's not a lot of data to support that argument. And as you saw from our brief tour of the rankings, the global rankings, there's countries all over the place, right? In terms of socioeconomic levels of development, just even in the top 10, there's a wide range. Another argument that has been given in terms how to explain this variation is in level of religiosity within a country. And this has level of religiosity, the kind of the intuition behind why that's a causal factor has changed over time. When I first became a political scientist, there was an assumption that countries that were a kind of a majority Catholic country or had a strong Catholic culture, for example, in Latin America, were unlikely to put a lot of women into positions of political power. But that turned out to be absolutely not the case. And over time, that association between Catholicism and the status of women actually seemed Latin American countries were in many ways more progressive than other countries. So there wasn't a lot of support for that. There has been a lot of discussion and a lot of thinking about the relationship between different religions and the status of women. And as you can see now, there's even that intuition doesn't really hold up just eyeballing the variation across the countries that you see. So something that has been long forwarded as an argument for the status of women or variation in the status of women doesn't go very far in terms of predicting women's share of political power. Another factor points to democratic versus authoritarian societies, or kind of liberal democracies versus countries that are communist or socialist, or have more or less kind of authoritarian regimes. Cuba here is a really interesting country. Cuba's in the second position. Cuba is a communist country. It's been communist since the revolution of 1959. And yet Cuba is in the second position. It's in number 2 slot in terms of the percentage of women in office. So there's something going on there that doesn't necessarily correlate with this idea that liberal democracies are more likely to have higher percentages of women in office. And there's other support for that as well across other countries. So these arguments about kind of the characteristics of countries, the culture, the political systems, the level of socioeconomic development, which have often been used, or there's assumptions about the more modern countries are, the more support they will have for women's rights and for women in political office. But the empirical evidence just doesn't really support that argument as tightly as we might expect. So there's a second set of arguments about what explains this variation, and that set of arguments points to the choices that individual women make. So if the first set of arguments is about structures of various countries, the second set of arguments is about do women want to run for office? Do they see themselves as qualified? And if they decide they do want to run for office, actually, can they run for office? And this has been, I'd say, one of the most interesting areas of research within political science. The leading kind of argument for what explains the percentage of women who run for office in the United States points to the idea that women tend, relative to men, not to see themselves as qualified to run for office, right? So just there's a gender gap in terms of people's natural proclivity to see themselves as a viable candidate for elective office. And so one of the policy solutions to that is that if women are asked, if someone puts in their, suggests to them, you know, I've been watching you in student government, I've been watching you in this community organization, I've been watching you in your work in your law firm, and I think you should run for office. That simple question of making that suggestion can be very powerful in terms of changing that assumption that women they see themselves as less qualified than men see themselves in terms of running for office. Another area of research that is people are starting to really dig more deeply into looks at kind of family responsibilities and structure within the family and the ways in which family responsibilities constrain women's choices. This is an argument that has been subject to increasing amounts of research in recent years, but I think we're going to see a lot of more study and focus on this question, thinking about the impact of the pandemic and the coronavirus on the status of women in the workplace in general, but also within the political arena. So I suspect that that is likely to be the focus of much more attention. So that second set of arguments is a very powerful one that points at individual agency and women's choices about whether or not to run for office. There's a third set of factors that is also the subject of lots of research, and that is the institutional rules that govern elections. So the electoral rules, or how an election is organized and how votes translate into seats, has a very powerful effect on who is likely to get elected to office, and differences in collective representation, such as gender or race or religion and other kinds of shared characteristics. And it turns out that the size of the electoral district and whether or not that district has one person, a single member district, or multiple people running within a single district or multi-member districts has a huge impact on whether or not, on the likelihood or the likelihood that women are elected to office. In the United States, we have single member districts for Congress. And this is the system, the electoral system that is has been identified as the least favorable to the election of women. So if electoral systems have a causal effect, and research has shown that they do, then it makes sense that despite all the predictions that you might have about the United States, it's the institutional rules that govern elections that cause the United States to have relatively few women serving in legislative office in Congress. A second aspect of electoral rules, of the institutional design of how elections are run, talks about the degree of proportionality in an electoral system. So this is the mechanism by which votes translate into the number of seats in an election. So does somebody need to simply get 50% plus one of the vote? Do they need to get a majority? Or is there a system in which they are able to obtain seats proportional to the votes for support of different parties, or proportional representation. So these two systems, first past the post is what the 50% plus one, or sometimes plurality systems are called, versus proportional representation. And those of you, I don't know where you're from, but your experiences with elections and how the electoral systems vary across countries, that can really have a huge impact. The final institutional variable with regard to how elections are shaped points to gender quota laws. And I see in the Q&A, there's a question about gender parity quotas. Gender quota laws are present in well over 100 countries in the world. They are present in Rwanda. They are present in the United Arab Emirates. They are present in Mexico, and those are 3 out of the top 4 countries, I think, top 10 countries in the world. Most of the countries at the top of the list have some kind of gender quota put into place. And most of those gender quotas are applied by law. So Congress passed a law in these countries that stipulate that a certain percentage of candidates for political office must be women. And in those countries, depending on the way that the law is written and implemented and enforced, can have a tremendous impact on increasing the percentage of women in elective office. Mexico is one of the most interesting countries with regard to gender parity. Mexico started out with voluntary quotas at the level of individual political parties making an informal commitment to increasing the percentage of women. The electoral law was changed at first to require that women be 25% of the multi-member districts. And eventually the law has changed so much that there's now a parity law in Mexico that requires that women hold 50% of the candidate slots in electable positions. And this has been a long struggle that is shared across political parties, but it has really been successful in keeping Mexico at a relatively high level of the percentage of women in office. There's a lot of questions that come up with gender parity, and certainly there's one that's been raised in the chat. But if we're simply trying to explain variation, cross-national variation in terms of the percentage of women in office, the data that I showed you, gender quotas are really seen to be one of the most powerful explanations for why some countries have higher rates than others. Now, gender quota laws in many countries are seen as a positive step toward increasing women's representation. The word quota in the United States has a lot of connotations associated with it that go back over the course of the entire 20th century as well as the 21st century. And given our electoral system, it's difficult to imagine gender quotas being applied to congressional elections. That said, political parties in the United States have had gender quotas at various points of time, and the Democratic Party maintains a gender quota to this day, or a parity law to this day, that requires equal representation of men and women as delegates in the national conventions of the party that take place every 4 years. So gender quota laws are an important aspect of this research. Now, we've kept a very narrow focus, or I've kept a very narrow focus in this talk, but there are a lot of questions that are what I would call normative questions about how things should work. One of those questions is, what difference does it make to have men versus women in elective office? And that in and of itself is also the subject of huge amounts of research. That is called substantive representation. Does having a woman in office mean different kinds of policy outcomes, different forms of representation? The answer is generally yes, in some limited cases, but that effect is fairly small in terms of the representation, but it is important and it's often statistically significant. What about people who don't identify as men or women? Gender quotas are kind of categorize, they kind of strengthen the category, this dichotomous categories of male and female. So what about candidates who don't comply with a binary conception of gender? How do we think about that? And then how important is it to increase the number of women in elective office, especially relative to other aspects of legislative representation that we might care about? What about working class people? What about race? What about levels of experience? There are other factors that we might want to highlight in terms of enhancing representation that's not necessarily due to gender. So I'm going to stop there, and in the time that we have, I'm going to ask Greg to feed me some of your questions, and I look forward to hearing what they are and seeing what we can do in terms of answering them.
Great, thank you so much, Professor Valdez. My dog is wandering around in here already. That was super interesting information, and I know we got one question from Alejandra, who I know is from Peru, by the way, and that you answered to start off with. But now we got a couple more coming in, so please feel free to post your questions to the Q&A, and I will either read them off or call on you. So we'll start with this first question from Emma Rochford, who said, do countries with low percentages of female legislators tend to have high levels of voter suppression?
Yeah, this is such a great question, Emma. And what I love about it is that this is not a question that would have been asked in the past, because voter suppression was not identified as the phenomenon that it is today, and kind of a high priority. Obviously, it's a very high priority issue in the country. It's an issue of some urgency. So one way I would think about that one way to answer that question would be to focus on the United States and look at variation across the 50 states. Because there, I think we have some variation in levels of voter suppression. And I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that's what's so great about teaching in a place like Dartmouth. Every new class of students that come in is bringing concerns that are reflective of the time in which you're living. And that's not a question that would have ever occurred to me, but it's an important question and one worth pursuing. So thanks for asking it.
Great. So I'm going to allow Jordan Neural, if you're there, I'm going to allow you to talk on here so you can ask the professor your question directly. If you don't mind just saying where you're watching from or where you go to high school so we can hear about where you're coming from, that would be great. So Jordan, you've been given permission to speak. If you don't mind, go right ahead and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Jordan Neural. I'm from Columbia, Missouri. I go to Hickman High School. My question is, do you think the level of women in office is reflective of women having access to the institutional methods of power in that society more broadly? And how do you think that relationship works? Is it like a chicken and egg situation where because women have more power, they're able to get more representation, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Jordan. It's really nice to hear from you. Nice to think about Missouri. I was at WashU in St. Louis, and I lived in Missouri for many years. So I hope we end up seeing you here. Here's the question that I would ask of you to think about. What do you mean by institutional power? What are the other arenas of power that you might expect would be correlated with women's access to political office? And one thing I might think about is the percentage of women in various career fields, right? So what's the law is often kind of a feeder career into legislative office. So how are women faring within the legal profession? And is there a correlation between the percentage of women in kind of partner track jobs within the legal profession or judicial positions that correlates with the percentage of women in elective office? So that's a great intuition on your part, and we'd have to think a little bit more about how we might measure that and think about it more kind of in terms of a way that we could look at some correlations. So great question. Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you so much, Jordan. The next person I was going to call on is Prescott Herzog. So Prescott, you've been given permission to talk. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question after letting us know where you're coming from.
Yeah, hi, my name is Prescott Herzog. I'm from Claremont, New Hampshire, Stevens High School. And my question is, in countries where there are a certain amount of seats in a parliament based on party performance, so like Germany and Australia, Have the parties also kind of followed that gender quota format, or is it kind of based on the values of each individual party?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Way to represent New Hampshire. Glad to see somebody from Stevens. Hope you make it up the road. That's great. So what's so interesting to me about gender quotas is that where they are applied, they apply to all political parties across the political spectrum, right? So they are implemented by law, and when something is implemented by law, you have to do it, right? And one of the reasons that's happened is because women have seen that this benefits them as individuals regardless of what party they're in. So they're able to kind of push the parties to adopt laws like this, and then hold the parties to account regardless of what the strategy or ideology or policy platform of particular parties are. There are political parties that also have other aspects of gender quotas as a voluntary measure within their own party. So for example, some parties stipulate that a certain percentage of the leaders within the party have to be women. And there you are going to see some variation with more parties more on the center left, tending to do that more often than parties on the center right. But great intuition. And I think that's one of the things that I find really interesting about quotas is that they kind of cut across the left-right dimension, and they apply to all parties the same.
Super interesting. Adam Tobeck. So Adam, you're the last one who's put their name in here so far. The rest are anonymous. So if you want to get the chance to speak with the professor, make sure you don't do an anonymous. If not, I'll ask the question. But Adam, you've been given permission to talk, so go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there. My name's Adam Tobeck. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California, and I go to Heritage High School. My question was, you mentioned how the United States congressional elections are first past the post. I was wondering if there's any research or if you have any thoughts about implementing ranked choice voting and if that would have an impact on the gender imbalance, seeing as a lot of arguments for RCV are that it would people take more risks, seeing that as their vote actually would count if it's under 50% threshold.
Yeah, another great question. Again, that one that hasn't been asked a lot, certainly not in the United States, because that just hasn't been in the realm of possibilities. But now it's very much in the realm of possibilities, and people are talking about it a lot. You even refer to it as an acronym, which suggests it has salience in the world that it didn't have in the past. So this is an interesting question, and one of the things about gender quotas, and this is both an argument for them as well as a potential argument against them, is that political parties tend to be adopted in countries where the party leaders choose the slate of candidates, right? So in Mexico, party leaders basically, they say, we've got a list of 20, and you're going to go at the top, and then I'm going to alternate men, women according to the law. But the party leaders pick and appoint candidates to every slot on that electoral list. In the United States, if you want to run for office and you fit the constitutional qualifications, you can run for office, right? So we don't have that party control. We have a primary system. And so where voters have a little bit more choice, that's an interesting question as to whether or not voters are more, when they have more choice, are they more likely to choose more women or not? And the research that we do have, and I think it's really worth revisiting, there's no strong conclusion either way, that there's a kind of, we call it competing conclusions to that research, because there aren't a lot of cases where this is the case. I know we have someone from Peru here that Greg mentioned. In Peru, voters get to choose, they get 2 votes. And at one point in Peru, there was a campaign to de los dos puestos, dale uno a la mujer. So you've got 2 votes, so why not give one to a woman? And it was very successful in increasing the percentage of women in elective office. So that suggests that where voters have a choice, they may be more willing to appoint women. But most of the parties, most of the systems that have quotas are systems in which party leaders pick candidates. And that's kind of problematic, because then those candidates are loyal to their party leaders, and they're reporting to their party leaders. Their careers depend on their loyalty to the party leaders, and not necessarily to voters. So you may get more women, But the degree to which those women are representing the interest of their constituents, I would argue, is much lower. Great question.
Super, thank you so much for that question. Now, since we've just touched on Peru and Alejandra hasn't typed another question, Alejandra, I'll call on you so you can ask a question, and then we'll go to Sheena after Alejandra. So Alejandra, you've been given permission to talk. Go ahead.
Thank you, Greg. Hi, Professor Lisa. Well, my question goes to something related on what is happening right now. We already had elections on Sunday, and everything's super crazy. And my question is, it goes on like, how can we deal with conservative women legislators in order to open more safe spaces for women that wants to participate on the political field? Like, we had the possibility to have a leader as Keiko Fujimori, that she's the daughter of from the dictator. I don't know how to say it exactly in English, but yeah, but she's daughter of Alberto Fujimori. So everything is super messy, and everybody's seeing her as the savior of democracy, and she's representing women, but she's also conservative. So how can we deal with that? Thank you for this.
A great question, Alejandra. I think it's really important. And this is actually where most of my research has focused. As I mentioned before, gender quota laws impose the quotas upon parties across the ideological spectrum. So the percentage of women increases across all parties. And it doesn't necessarily, electing a woman to office doesn't mean much in terms of specific policy priorities, right? That depends on your party. It depends on your own personal ideology. There's very much a sense for some people that being a woman is associated with supporting women's rights. And we saw this very much after the election of Donald Trump in the United States in 2016, where the day after inauguration, the Women's March was the largest set of protests that the United States has ever seen. It was so highly mobilized of women who were opposed to Donald Trump and opposed to his policy agenda and to his practice as an individual person. But at the same time, what was overlooked and really not taken account of in that march was that a majority of white women in the United States had supported Donald Trump, right? So here you have this massive women's march, but you also have a majority of one sector of women supporting a Republican and conservative candidate. So that suggests to me that being a woman, in terms of what kinds of issues will you bring to the table, there's no necessarily correlation between being a woman and bringing particular issues of concern, right? So there's a lot of enthusiasm for gender quotas. There's a lot of stress on the importance of electing women to office, but there are often assumptions about what that's going to mean for politics and for representation that are not borne out in fact, right? Because women are represented for all different political parties, all different kinds of positions. And I think it's important to recognize that and to really talk about what people mean when they want to increase women's political representation. And you've pointed to ways in which that can be messy, as you've suggested, which is a great word to describe it. Thanks so much for that question.
Sheena Han, I'm going to allow you to talk next. You have a question, then we'll go to Iris Beth. I know the professor, we only have a few minutes left, so maybe 1, 2, possibly 3 questions, depending on how much content comes as part of the answer. So here goes Sheena, go ahead.
Hi, I'm from Los Alamos High School in New Mexico. And my question is, do you typically see a link between the percentage of women in elected office and the percentage of women in appointed office, which obviously it's harder for us to directly control those positions. So how do we ensure that women are considered for those appointments as well?
Yeah, there actually are some countries that have quota laws for women in executive branch positions, right? Or they appointed positions within government departments and government ministries. I believe Colombia is one of them. This is not something I've followed, so I'm not fresh on the recent changes on that. So part of the answer depends on are there rules constraining the choices that an executive can make in terms of making appointments to his or her cabinet and to all kinds of political appointments in the bureaucratic structure. But the question of correlation between executive and administrative, or executive and legislative branches, is a really interesting one. And I think it gets to back to that point about characteristics of particular countries, and what are the factors that would lead them to adopt laws that apply both to executive and legislative office. There's a third aspect that I think is really important that is gaining a lot of support worldwide, and that is laws that require corporate boards to have gender parity, or at least some kind of gender quota applied to corporate boards. And this gets to the question from, I believe, is it Prescott? Was Prescott from Columbia, Missouri, about institutional power. So some would argue that corporate boards make decisions that have a huge, huge impact. And there's two reasons. One is those boards and corporations tend to, the percentage of women is relatively low. But there's also research that suggests the more diverse your board is within a particular company or corporation, the better your financial bottom line is going to be, right? So that's part of the rationale for adopting these laws in countries around the world. And it's really gaining a lot of credibility. So really great questions that go in lots of possible different directions.
A question, you got the town right. I think it was Jordan Nerall, who was from Missouri.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I see you. There you are, Jordan. Thanks.
Okay, so we got time. This will be the last question. So I'm going to call on Arsbeth, who has posted a question with her name attached to it before the professor has to head out. So Arsbeth, go ahead and ask this last question. Take us home.
All right. Hi, my name's Arisbeth, and I'm from Dallas, Texas. And my question is, with the overall percentage of female legislators increasing over time, does female representation stay a consistent 25-ish across local politics and higher positions, or do certain positions just naturally attract more female candidates?
That's an interesting question. I think to really answer it, I would need to look at data on different levels of political office. And in the United States, the conventional wisdom is that there's a pipeline from local level office to state level office to federal level office, right? To Senate, to vice president, to president. And that is kind of the way that women get, it's one pathway in which women get involved in political office, right? They start out local and they kind of move their way up. It doesn't always work that way. Cuba is one country where the candidates for the National Assembly or the deputies in the National Assembly of People's Power, there are elections. They are not necessarily competitive elections, or at least they are less competitive, but the elections at the local level are very competitive. And so the percentage of women holding office at the local level, at local level assemblies in Cuba, is much lower than it is at the national level. So there's not necessarily a correlation across different levels of political office. And a lot of that depends on distribution of power. Where's what can the legislature do? Do they have budgetary authority? What is their what's within the scope of their decision making that explains the variation? But it's an interesting idea, and that's kind of how things work in the United States. There tends to be correlation, but it doesn't hold up across all countries.
Great. So thank you so much. Thank you everybody for your questions. They were fantastic. Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful presentation. Check out the admitted students website for upcoming events. There are a lot. We're having stuff every evening. Tomorrow at 7, we'll have another faculty feature. So be on the lookout for those opportunities, and appreciate everybody's attention and time, and really interesting discussion and dialogue and questions for this event. Hope you all have a nice evening. or
Great to
nice,
meet you all. Thanks for your questions. Really fun
nice
to talk to
morning
you.
or afternoon, wherever you are.